Welcome, everyone. I'm going to be doing a seventh eye today, which is where all of you send me questions, either write them in the comments, or some people send me emails. I am not going to do the whole letter this time, partially because of length, but also identifying information for the individual, as well as it can introduce some biases that I don't think are helpful. So this woman contacted me talking about how she grew up in a specific denomination, a specific religious persuasion, and that this religion particularly believed in spiritual warfare. And so she's wondering because she heard that basically the lighter you get, the more you will be attacked, the more that you will have to deal with spiritual warfare, dark spirits, difficult circumstances, all of this sort of stuff. And so the essential question is, if you have done your work, if you are engaged in the path of spiritual awakening, when you get to a certain point, is it true that you will be attacked by darkness, by evil, because they see your light? So I thought that this was an interesting question. It is one that I've gotten in varying ways through the years, because people come to me with all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of religious and spiritual persuasions and teachings. And this seems to be a common and pervasive thread. And so my answer to this may surprise some of you, which is kind of yes, but perhaps not in the way that people conceptualize it. I find that thinking about it in a different way to be helpful. So here's the way that I think about it. Before people really start to look at themselves, it's kind of like they're in a workplace with 100 people and they may hate, dislike, try to tear down, criticize, just kind of have negative feelings towards 98 or 97 of those 100 people. This is where a lot of people tend to start. And this is, if you followed, any of my shadow work material, kind of a basic thought of the shadow is that we try to tear down others, criticize others, because the real person we desire to tear down, to break down, is ourselves. It's out of our own self-hatred, out of our own ignorance, out of our own self-loathing that we do this. And you can see this all over in the world and online and, all of this sort of stuff that people treat others the way that they feel internally. They are externalizing their own conflicts into the world, their own outlook of the world out into the world. When we are what we might define as unawakened or just starting to awaken, meaning interest in spirituality, but it isn't embodied yet. We haven't really done much of the work yet. Our days are going to be filled with kind of those micro and macro conflicts where we are continually looking for what is wrong with reality. We will have a negative disposition towards reality because we lack basic awareness of the self. This doesn't mean as you awaken that you think everybody is a beam of light or anything like that. It is just that desire to tear down the world, to tear down other people, lessens because partially you become aware of how you want to spend your time. And secondarily, you recognize that, and take responsibility for the feelings, the emotions, the realities within, rather than taking them out, externalizing them on others. So when somebody does inner work, like shadow work or any type of inner work where they're truly looking at their stuff, that number then reduces. Maybe it's 75 out of 100 people at work at first. Then they keep on doing their work and it turns into 50, 40, 30, 10. And so this number continues to reduce. Just for the sake of this example, I will talk about, let's say it gets to those 10 people or maybe even 5 people. So what has happened to this person is that they generally are in a state of positivity or neutrality or acceptance towards 95 of the people that they work with. But what happens with those 5 is that those 5 people that they are still in conflict with, that they still dislike, that they still experience hatred towards, become really, really obvious to them. And so let's take this out into the world, where it's not just those 100 people, it is all of humanity. And so somebody goes through the same process, just as the example I listed, and you eventually get to a place where you're like, you feel that state of acceptance for people, that state of equanimity for people, that state of recognizing that you cannot control other people or their actions. You grow into a state where you no longer feel conflict with people. And this is one of my favorite descriptions for the result of spiritual awakening, um, or in fact, enlightenment, which is the end of conflict. And so, what I find happens is that the universe, or whatever your conceptualization of it, provides us with the people, situations, and sort of events, but particularly the people and the situations that we are still in conflict with. And so, what happens when you are at the beginning of your path, everything is something for you to tear down. It's like having 5,000 voices screaming at you. You're not going to be perhaps even aware that 5,000 voices are screaming at you. But if you are, it's sort of like, the thought of, like everybody bothers me, where to begin, sort of thing. As you do your work, as you gain basic sort of emotional skills, stability, maturity, as you really start to look at your own stuff, this starts to reduce. You start to be less negative towards the world, less seeking to do harm to others out of your own pain. Basically, you really start to take responsibility for yourself. Another favorite definition of mine of spiritual awakening is having the insight and capacity to take responsibility for your own emotional reactions and to really look at the source of them. And so let's go back to the question about spiritual warfare and about darkness being attracted to light. And I said that I think that that is true in a certain regard. But what I really find is that if you are in a position where you feel developing and stabilizing peace in your life, what you are going to be very aware of are the people and situations that do not provide you peace, that you are still in conflict with. The same thing goes even deeper. If you go into what I consider the not just me, but kind of the finalization state, um, of abiding love, and pulsation. But if you are in a state where you are like, I love everyone except for these 10 people, what is going to happen is that you are not only going to really notice those 10 people, is that they are going to be sort of magnetized for you. The universe is going to provide you the opportunity of those people essentially being magnetized to you to show you where you still need to do work. Basically, if your recognition or realization is like, oh, I could feel this abiding sense of peace and love, and understanding and all that sort of stuff, except for Todd, screw Todd and everybody like Todd. I'm just picking a name. Sorry if your name is Todd, but what is going to happen is that Todd is going to keep on coming into your life, showing up in your life, and you are going to keep on experiencing Todds until you can get to the point of getting to the root of why there is hatred for Todd, and everybody like Todd, everybody that falls into the same pattern as Todd, because as people, we very much fall into patterns of personality, patterns of dealing with things, patterns of reactivity. And so I find that a more positive outlook of this is that the universe is really showing you areas that you are still in conflict regarding, and that you can look at, why do I have a sense of peace and love except for everybody like Todd, and take that as an opportunity. So I've already talked about kind of the first layer of things, which is that if you get into greater and greater states of, abiding peace, abiding presence, abiding love, what happens is that the parts of you that are not there become very glaringly obvious. Those people will come into your life more and more. They will not only become more obvious because you're like, why do I hate everybody but Todd, or everybody like Todd? Um, I also find that the universe kind of accelerates a bit, where maybe before you only encountered the Todds of the world on rare occasion, suddenly, because let's just say 98% of yourself is in a state of peace, and this 2% is Todd, you know, all of a sudden the universe is going to keep on causing for Todd to come into your life, and people like Todd in an accelerating way, in a magnetizing way, until you recognize that, hey, I love and feel acceptance for everyone except for people like Todd and his personality structure, and do something to heal it. And then at that point, the Todds of the world will still be present, but they won't be sort of thrown at you by the universe. They won't be magnetized to you. Um, they will still be present, but your focus on them will change. It will go to a state of acceptance. And I will say that the state of acceptance with people may be, oh, this person is wonderful, and I used to think that they were, sucked. It also may be, I realize that this person is kind of like a cobra, and much like I don't fault a cobra for striking out, I'm not going to fault this person for doing the same. There can be a lot of recognition, this is perhaps a different video, but that people most often are really locked into what they learned in early childhood development. And what that means is that if people had an unsafe home, if they learned how to manipulate, lie, steal, if they learned they needed to get attention in a specific way, if they needed to learn they needed to be perfect to gain any sort of acceptance, if they got really stagnated in their emotional development because there was nobody there to teach them. Yes, they're going to turn into, somebody who is a 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old who is still manipulating, still throwing temper tantrums like they are too, because they haven't looked at those behaviors, they haven't healed from those experiences, they haven't done the self-reflective work to sort of get there. Um, and so I find really being aware of this is really a key to acceptance as well as letting go of desire for our control over other people, which is a big one for kind of all of us, but especially people getting to kind of mid and late stages of the path, is that you recognize um, and let go of our attempt to try to control ourselves and to try to control the universe, try to control other people out of fear, uncertainty, desire for mastery, all that sort of stuff. But let's talk a little bit more about kind of the metaphysics of this, because I do get people who quite a bit are worried about things like um, spirits attacking them, about, evil spirits and all of that sort of stuff. A lot of that, I do have to say, is indoctrination from various religions and spiritual paths. And my thought of that in general is that um, if people contact spirit directly, if they have the power and capacity to develop their own inner guru, their own clear connection to divinity, that they don't need an intermediary anymore, or they may need it in a limited capacity. On the other end of this are a lot of people who are, delusional and really could use a teacher to ground them. But I do find from sort of a systemic approach that there is so much fear and so much propaganda because it keeps people in a state of fear. It keeps people immobilized. And what do people in a state of fear who are immobilized do? They look for an authority figure who can, tell them what to think, tell them what to believe, tell them how to act. So, all that being said, let's go to kind of the metaphysical aspects of this, like talking about, is evil, so to speak, attracted to people who become lighter? What I notice on one level is that the more embodied you are, the more full of yourself, so to speak. So every cell, every part of your body, every part of your energy field is filled with your own energy, your own essence, then there is no room for other people's energy or other spirits or that sort of stuff to gain access. So this is a big deal for sensitives as well, because if you are sensitive and you are totally out of your body, well, coming into the body, taking care of your own emotions, learning how to ground, learning how to be in your body bit by bit is the best long-term solution. For shorter term and intermediate solutions, I very much suggest my books, Managing Psychic Abilities, um, as well as the Body Deva. This is another thing that I will mention is that when you take care of your own stuff, there will actually be less spirits, less dark things attracted to you overall. Because what those things are attracted to is like versus like. This happens with people, this happens in the spirit realms as well. If you are holding on to a whole lot of unprocessed grief, unprocessed anger, that what can happen is that a like energy, a like person, a like energy, a like spirit who is on that sort of same wavelength um, will be attracted and will see an opening there, some sort of vulnerability, some sort of like-mindedness in spirit and energy and emotion. Does this mean that it is your fault? No, by no means. If you are, for example, going through a process where you are feeling depressed and feeling really sad, this isn't meant to put you in a state of fear. What it is meant to sort of highlight to somebody is that a really positive aspect of things is that if you really start to work on yourself, work on your own inner work, kind of focus within instead of without, what happens is that a lot of those outer happenings that people are really worried about, a lot of those outer conflicts, a lot of the attraction of friends or other people that are, you know, unfortunate to what we might consider dark, a lot of that will start to drop away because you have healed emotions and conflicts within yourself. And so, one of the last things that I will share is that when I talk about these things, it is either to take an all, it's easy to take an all or nothing approach and not come into a state of nuance. What that means is that for the first, I would say, and again, I'm just making up numbers here just to describe things. For the first 3/4 of the path, what you are really looking for are states of connection and union. And so this is what shadow work is perfect for. There are a lot of great ways of going at this, though. And what those states of connection and union are is like, oh, wow, I really am part of the earth. I feel connected to the earth. I feel connected to the sky. I feel connected to the divine. I feel connected to all that is. I feel connected to myself. And in terms of other people, developing a connecting sense of looking at that person and connecting to them in a state of empathy because you can recognize that you both are human and that on some level you connect with one another, that they are composed of the same stuff that you are, that life is difficult, that you can in some way see a mirror to them within them and a mirror to you from them as well. So there's a reflective process that happens where empathy can develop instead and connection can develop instead of feeling separate, or developing hatred, dislike, desire to tear the other person down, um, out of your own ignorance and self-hatred. However, there does come a point where somebody very much needs to go through that, realizing that connection. And what happens during that last sort of quarter is interesting because you go into a state of union, a state of oneness with everything. And kind of at the same time, paradoxically, what happens is that you still experience that state of union, but you start to come into a state of individuation. You start to separate. You recognize who you are versus who the person next to you is, and your motivations, ways of being, morals, how you go about life, your stories, your experiences of this world are quite different. And so, in some cases, this can be an extraordinarily beautiful difference. Somebody may have grown up in a different spiritual, cultural tradition than you, and they invite you into their home and you hear their stories and you smell the smells of their home and kind of go in and have a meal and experience what the family structure is like, and it is beautiful and it changes your perspective of things and you're like, wow, this is really different, this has really expanded my own sense of self. Travel can do the same thing for those of us who can, venture out somewhere that is away from our usual routine. There's some mind expansiveness of going beyond our own routines and seeing places that feel a bit alien to us, so to speak, where we can recognize, so to speak, that um, this is a place that is different than me, different than my world, different than what I conceptualize reality is. Isn't that beautiful? However, what also happens to people during this time is that they recognize that a lot of people who have gotten to this point recognize that they have gotten to this place because they are the type who take a lot of responsibility for themselves. It takes a lot of dedication, a lot of willingness to look within, typically some type of spiritual impulse that is sort of pushing them forward, and not only pushing them forward, but to gain a dedicated practice and some sort of consciousness or energy within them that lets them really consistently question their own biases, their own limitations, their own limited sort of perspective of reality, of people, so that can expand. But there does come a difficult time for people where they do recognize and may go into anything from grief to existential sort of despair to just kind of shock to the system, of really and truly recognizing that a lot of people are guided by some pretty heavy trauma, by some pretty dark stuff. That there are people that truly act monstrously in this world. There are people that do not consider other people. There are people that cannot be self-reflective, take responsibility for themselves. There are people who literally cannot see anyone other than themselves. And there are people who do terrible, awful things to one another. And a lot of this we can liken to trauma, maybe even generational trauma. That doesn't excuse it. There are plenty of us who have experienced trauma who we've been like, we don't want to repeat that cycle. But there are also people who are so guided by impulse, by sort of this atavistic instinct, this sort of primal animalistic self, where they may get glee out of harming other people. They may do all variety of horrific things to one another without a sense of morals, without a sense of, um, uh, awareness. They may even, I talked about this in my victim video, they may even be in a place where they abuse and harm others and then claim that they are the victim. And all of this can get very, very dark. And a lot of us have the capacity to blind this out, shield this out, or push it away from ourselves. There is a reason why all of those murder podcasts and Datelines and all of those documentaries on um, Netflix and HBO and all those places are so popular. And it's because we are fascinated by humans. We're fascinated by darkness. But we also, by being an observer, by sort of it being on our television screen instead of our home, feel a sense of power over it. We are the observer. We are not a direct participant of those things. And those things really are an anomaly in our reality. They are, but somebody going into kind of the last phase of spiritual awakening recognizes that this person, yes, I can sort of see a mirror to myself and them. We're both human, but they operate from a very distinct, different sense of morals, emotional intelligence, um, how they treat others, all of that sort of stuff than I do. And so this can, when somebody is able to assimilate this, there can be a recognition of the darkness of reality. And at first, it can be a recognition of, like, oh, all of us have the capacity to be quite dark. But later on, there can be a recognition of, yes, this is how some people operate in reality, and they are operating from such a destructive, nihilistic um, perspective. And I no longer relate to that, or I cannot relate to that. And so going into a state of acceptance of this behavior lets somebody kind of heal and recognize that we are connected to all that is, but we are also separate at the same time. And that is why darkness sort of comes into the life of somebody who becomes quite aware, quite light on a metaphysical level, is because it is helping them to fully shape and find themselves, to realize what they are and what they are not. I will talk just for a moment about the energetics of this. When you are quite light, by that, I mean that you have integrated a lot of your own and accepted a lot of your own darkness in an embodied way. You've worked through traumas and emotions. You feel within your body, within the present moment. You've gone through your shadow work or other inner work to a point where you feel kind of that sense of peace and love in general. Is that when darkness comes your way, that darkness recognizes that if it were to approach your light, it would be transformed or healed by your light. Um, and in recognizing this, that darkness, be it within a person or be it a spiritual or energetic principle, um, will either welcome that opportunity to be healed in some capacity, or they will go far away from you. And this may not even be a conscious thing. One of the cautions that I do give about this is that people who do become quite light do become essentially mirrors. And so people who are still incredibly suffering within themselves, what they're going to see reflected is their own stuff, their own issues, their own suffering. And there are some people who specifically seek out gurus and teachers who have that capacity to reflect back their blind spots, to reflect back where they need work and where they've been successful. And there are some people who so hate that they are going to use that as a reason to further go into their own darkness. And this is how projection and all that sort of stuff happens, because it is likely that people on that far end of the spectrum who see that mirror and don't like what they're seeing are going to blame you for everything that they've seen in themselves that they are not at a place to be able to recognize within. So I've seen some people that get confused by this. And so hopefully all of this consideration is helpful to you. As with all things, I suggest that people go about their curiosity about other people, about the world, about the spirit realms, about everything like that with curiosity and openness rather than fear. It is much like our reality, in that, sounds like a strange thing to end on, but like, are there serial killers out there? Yes. Is it likely that you are going to be the victim of one? No, probably not. Same thing that goes for people also goes for the spirit realms, which is reflective uh, of our physical reality. So I hope that this has helped. Short answer is yes, but perhaps less in a, a television show, HBO type show drama, and more in a here's an opportunity for further work, for further growing your light, if you should choose to take it.